A go! Hey, everyone. I'm John Coleman from ApocatastasisInstitute, an institute for the humanities and alternative college and high school here on New Milford, Connecticut, USA. This recording is entitled Hoch Der Kaiser, and it is our project day number 298. Briefly, if you're not familiar, the project is our unified curricula here at Apocatastasis. We have many classes, many standalone courses, but one way to draw together our enrolled students, our full-time students in particular, our monthly students, our alumni, and the larger learning community is this project. So we have many other things besides this project, but this is the touchstone, bringing all of our learners here at the Institute together in a yearly review of all of human history for those who are enrolled full-time that study has a few years where we go over and over and over different points in human history and Western history in particular. Um, and then for people who have less ability to commit and perhaps less interest, less time on their hands, whatever the case may be, they too can join in on this sequential study of human events. The core of this project, as we're going to get into today, is H.G. Wells's Outline of History with a hefty serving of poetry. For those who are enrolled in a more committed fashion, over 2 and 3 years for our undergraduate program, we also include the Durant's Story of Civilization series. And I invite you to check out the link down below for the project and see what fits for you. All of us have an obligation to learn. The greatest human faculty is reason, and let's use that. And before we hop along into our study of this run up to the First World War, let's have a brief advertisement concerning Apocatastasis. Here is our website, also down below. And I would like to bring your attention and mine in this episode, indeed, to this address. We're going to need a bigger boat. APOC's next step. You can see a video that I did on this as well as a newsletter. We need a location. We need a location, and we're really not going to truly get underway with reforming and building culture from which all good things in society obtain. If the culture is not manured and healthy and robust, no other betterment will long endure. And that's why we need a location for classes, for cultural events, for spiritual events, all of the many fronts, if we're talking about the First World War, that we operate on here in Connecticut and farther afield. We need a location. It is simply the missing element, daily interaction with each other. If we wonder why our culture has gone down the drain, we don't know our next door neighbors, we don't know our music, we don't have a religion, we don't know which, literally, we don't know which way is north. If we had to find it on our own, we don't read books. We can't read books. Adults tell me this. I thank them for their candid honesty. They say they can't read at 30 years of age. Not that they can't form words, but their brain is turned to goo. Well, I shouldn't say the only way we're going to turn this around, but the most effective way to use our resources is with a physical location. There simply is no culture without this. Online stuff is simply an adjunct. So I invite you to check this out. And this is going to be an ongoing project that, please God, as time and resources indeed allow, I will address every month until it comes to pass. And then I'm going to keep addressing it because location, stability, here-ness is that glue which we have so neglected in society. So if we mean to restore society, enrich society, manure society, we must have a location. So there you go for your advertisement and all sorts of other great things going on here. All right. The image we had is Kaiser Wilhelm I. As I get our background music queued up. I did not have time to get appropriate German music, so you'll have to do with the Irish. Whenever you see this blue background, it's because we've run out of our monthly allotment on main site. And so usually about this last part of the month, although we still have another month and change actually for July, so I've been burning through the time given. But whenever you see this green here, if you don't know what I'm talking about, you see how that wavy green, oh, come on. Really? Oh my goodness. It's actually worse. Okay. Depending on what option I use here, you should see the green at the very top, and probably more so during the intro time, where we had this gentleman The green background anyway means I had to switch to another channel, and I haven't quite gussied this one up with all sorts of robust musical assortments from different countries. So you're going to have to deal with the Irish stuff. And this is Kaiser Wilhelm I. This section, which by the way is section 2 of chapter 38, on this day 298 of the project, we begin again on August 31st. We will be looking at primarily Germany and the Hohenzollerns, and like father, like son. That one place in the world where the 18th century monarchy seemed to continue into the 20th, Germany. And there are some interesting insights as I look down at the book. There are some interesting insights that H.G. Wells has, and we encourage you to download the outline of history for free from the project site in the description. Before we get into the text and I switch the camera, our poem. We're approaching the First World War. And we have, most appropriately, For All We Have and Are by Rudyard Kipling. For all we have and are. Now, today we're not going to quite get into the war itself, but we're getting close enough that we can start using the war poetry. So this is an early rah-rah poem, written, of course, from the British point of view, following the German ingress of Belgium, which was a neutral country. This is indeed Kipling, whom you know from the Jungle Book. For all we have and are, for all our children's fate, stand up and take the war. The Hun is at the gate. Our world has passed away, in wantonness o'erthrown. There is nothing left today but steel and fire and stone. Though all we knew depart, the old commandments stand. In courage keep your heart, in strength lift up your hand. Once more we hear the word that sickened earth of old. No law except the sword, unsheathed and uncontrolled. Once more it knits mankind, once more the nations go to meet and break and bind a crazed and driven foe. Comfort, content, delight, the age's slow-bought gain. They shriveled in a night, only ourselves remain, to face the naked days in silent fortitude, through perils and dismays renewed and renewed. Though all we may depart, the old commandments stand. In patience keep your heart, in strength lift up your hand. No easy hope or lie shall bring us to our goal, but iron sacrifice of body, will, and soul. There is but one task for all, one life for each to give. What stands if freedom fall? Who dies if England live? Thus is For All We Have and Are by Rudyard Kipling. And that's a pretty good balance for what's coming up, which is a largely German-focused section. So that, in fact, is one of the meditations that H.G. Wells brings to our attention. I'll end the screen share here, and we will also, just so you know, by way of screen share, finish up looking at Kaiser Wilhelm's arm, which is something Wells mentions. It's something psychohistorians are interested in, that is to say, interpreting history through the psychological prism of historical actors, including men like the Kaiser, who had a withered arm, which is something Wells brings up today. How does that psychology of handicap affect one's behavior? It's called psychohistory. That's one example. There are many others from German history, in fact. And all of this we can consider the Sonderweg, that separate path of Germany that certain historians trace back even to the classical period and Germany's not having been a part of the Roman Empire. This consciousness of not having been part of the Roman Empire, informing Kaiser Wilhelm in today's selection, chapter 38, section 2, as H.G. Wells notices and notes for us that he resisted the implementation of the common Latin script in Germany in favor of a Gothic script in use for newspapers, etc., etc. So those lingering realities, why on earth would a 20th century leader be playing off of this reality? Why would you not let typical Latin script into Germany prior to the First World War? Right? Well, history at that time was a much more present reality, and the consequences of history for not just the hoi polloi in academia, but for Joe Blow on the street. And so that reality of Germany not having been part of the Roman Empire, that is something that people, even so-called common people, could pick up on, and the consequences of that. This was a very historically conscious time. In any case, one of the other things that Wells brings up as I cite this camera is the legacy of education and economics to the time period before the First World War. And here we ought to have our camera in action, although facing a ridiculous direction. There we go. Germany, as we've talked about, going back even to the first part of the 19th century and stemming from the lessons learned during the Napoleonic Wars, and particularly that traumatic Battle of Jena, Germany completely, and Prussia, which becomes Germany, just like, in a sense, New England becomes America, and the Red River Basin becomes China. One part of the nation dominates the rest. Paris becomes France. One locale gets to speak for everyone in the liberal nation state. Oh no, this is backwards, right? No? Okay, it's backwards to me, but it is facing in the right direction. I don't know what happened with these updates on the computer, but I used to be able to read this right side up like you can. I know you can because I checked the recordings afterwards. But for some reason, the last few months, it's gone back to how the machine actually picks it up. As you know, in optics, cameras pick things up backwards. In any case, after Jena and through the 19th century, Germany was almost like, or what becomes Germany, like Japan that we've looked at. After certain military defeats and certain things, it goes from being behind the times, so to speak, in modernity and the Enlightenment, to scrambling to catch up, and in certain ways overtaking other lands which had been on a certain progress, so-called, for a much longer time. And one of the places you see that is Europe. And we will cite this particular paragraph, and I mean that with an S, to cite like a gun. I'm just looking here. Okay, there we go. A teacher, a professor who did not teach and preach in and out of season the racial, moral, intellectual, and physical superiority of the Germans to all other peoples, their extraordinary devotion to war and their dynasty, and their inevitable destiny under that dynasty to lead the world, that teacher or professor was a marked man, doomed to failure in his job and obscurity. German historical teaching, which was again a lot more prominent than it is now, become an immense systemic falsification of the human past. This is Wells talking, with a view to the Hohenzollern future. All other nations were represented as incompetent and decadent. The Prussians were the leaders and regenerators of mankind. I'm going to bounce back here to these points that Wells makes, all in the ken of education. And then we'll get to economics. This educating, scientific, and organizing Germany was the natural development of the liberal Germany of 1848. We talked about that. We talked about this in the past, especially with American history. You can see that. In the mid-19th century, this very time, you can see Americans tripping over themselves to go and emulate Germany. I'm not the first to note, even to this very day, that our education system, public, private, and home, is basically a model, a copy of a copy of a copy, maybe, some generations on, of the German model, which was co-opted after the revolutions of 1848. So anyway, that's just a feather in the cap of how significant Germany was. Germany in spiritualistic circles, which it does influence Christianity, especially Protestant Christianity. Germany politically in its type of nationalism, Germany educationally, okay, already mentioned, artistically with Goethe and others, Romanticist schools, Sturm und Drang, I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that, storm and thunder, that whole reaction really to the French Revolution. All of that's Germany, and all of that continuing even at the beginning of the 20th century really makes Germany the cultural center of the world, linguistics and so forth, biblical studies. It had its roots as far back, as we said, as a Napoleonic conquest, and the shame that came from that. All that was good, all that was great in modern Germany, she owed to her schoolmasters. So there was an intense focus on education in Germany. Something else that marks Germany differently and puts it in a class of its own, something to be emulated, as many excellent people and many excellent classes is Germany's economic model. So you have to understand, as we approach the First World War, that there is a real competition between Britain and Germany. Now, racially, if you want to use that language, somewhat problematic, but altogether Darwinistic. Germany and English society, and we should even say English-speaking society, are kissing cousins. And this is a reality that we're going to need, indeed, as we approach the First World War as well as the Second. The fact that Germany and England and English-speaking cultures and German-speaking cultures outside of Germany are kissing cousins. And so it's interesting, you have two types of capitalism, and head and shoulders more humane and therefore more productive is German capitalism. And one thing I'll be introducing for the First and Second World Wars basically is English capitalism stomping down merciless English capitalism and American capitalism by extension, stomping down in the world wars humane German models of the same. And Wells notes the different economic models and why there would be this point, even in a rare critique of British society. We read these two paragraphs here. Throughout all this period of armed peace, and we looked at that in our last class, the attempts to head this off with the Geneva conferences and so forth, she was reaping and sowing, Germany, and reaping again the harvest, the unfailing harvests of freely disseminated knowledge. She grew swiftly to become a great manufacturing and trading power. Her steel output, Germany's steel output, outran the British, and in 100 new fields, production and commerce, where intelligence and system were of more account than mere traders' cunning. In the manufacture of optical glass, of dyes, of a multitude of chemical products, and in endless novel processes, she led the world. Why? Because Germany treated its workers as, not as a throwaway phrase, but truly as part of the family, as part of the success of the enterprise. Compare this now to the second paragraph, to the British manufacturer who was accustomed to see inventions come into his works. He knew not whence nor why. Because why? Because the British and the American is just a cunning trader. Not traitor, but trader. I'm speaking on top of Connecticut. If you read 19th century literature, that was something, mildly critically, that Connecticut men were known for just being tinkers, being merchants. All of this does, to be blunt, have to go back to the Jewish influence on English-speaking society after the Sephardic Jews were kicked out of Spain. They came up to England and the Low Countries, and so it's not for nothing. It's not for nothing that these societies become obsessed with commerce, and particularly a most inhumane and rack-renting type of commerce. That's the Jewish spirit in economics in action. Anyway, the British manufacturer was used to these inventions, begging to be adopted. This new German method of keeping and paying scientific men seemed abominably unfair. It was a compelling fortune, he felt. It was packing the cards. It was encouraging a nasty class of intellectuals to interfere in the affairs of sound businessmen. Science went abroad from its first home like an unloved child. Right, the initial natural science, that's how Wells is using this term science, meaning natural science. Science left England, which was so powerful when it came to natural science in the early Enlightenment period, early modern period. Like an unloved child, the splendid chemical industry of Germany was built on the work of Englishman Sir William Perkins, who could find no quote-unquote practical English businessman to back him. So there's your English Jewish utilitarianism. And Germany also led the way in many forms of social legislation. Germany realized that labor is a national asset, right? It's not every man for himself like in English capitalism, but labor is a national asset. It's a national treasure like the oil or other minerals, so-called, underneath the soil. And that labor deteriorates. This is what the English capitalists never understood. Labor deteriorates through unemployment, and that for the common good, it has to be taken care of outside the works. Right? So this leads in the German capitalistic model to, as we'll find out, all sorts of humanitarian implementations. Long before you have ersatz solutions like the New Deal here in these United States, right? Labor needs to be cared for outside of the factory, and we'll get into those specifics. The British employer and the American was still under the delusion that labor had no business to exist outside the works. There's your factory towns here in New England and in England proper, and that the worse such exterior existence was for the British, the better somehow it was for him. Moreover, because of the British workers' general illiteracy, he was an intense individualist. And wow, something is clicking in my own writing here. I'm doing a very, very extensive essay, almost a small book at this point, on piety. And this is helping plug in a few points. Illiteracy and individualism. I should want to follow up on that. The British capitalist, the British worker, was the intense rivalry of the vulgar mind. His was the intense rivalry, insensate rivalry of the vulgar mind. He hated his fellow manufacturers. This is the shopkeeper that Himmler or Goebbels mentioned, describing the British society, the American as well as it. branch society of England. This petty British capitalist hated his fellow manufacturers. Do we not see this nowadays? About as much as he hated his labor and his customers. German producers, on the other hand, who realize that labor is a national asset, they're not so foolish and myopic. They were persuaded of the great advantages of combination and civility. Their enterprises tended to flow together and assume more and more the character of national undertakings. You have to see the world wars, even in these run-up years. You must see the world wars as the fight to the knife of two different types of capitalism. And then follows in this section from Wells an extensive treatment of Kaiser Wilhelm II. Kaiser Wilhelm I was the gentleman who led off this class, and of course, very conveniently numbered. He had a son named as much for himself, and we're going to now enjoy an article looking at psychohistory entitled Treating the Kaiser's Withered Arm. So once again, psychohistory is looking at historical events through the prism of the psychologist and of the events, usually traumatic, of historical actors. When it comes to Germany, another example would be Luther, Martin Luther, and his family background. You know, how does Luther's appreciation of his father affect Martin Luther's appreciation of God the Father, and how does that subsequently influence his theology? Another one would, of course, be Adolf Hitler, and how does his experience in the First World War and the after-war effects, getting ahead of ourselves, of course, how does that affect the political career, military choices of himself? I'm going to check the tech here, and nope, are we good? Yep, that's working. And okay, and our background music is chugging along, so we're grand, we're good to go. With the Irish stuff, you can't put it up too loud or it might be obnoxious. And then other times in the playlist, it's not quite as loud as you'd like. But anyway, treating the Kaiser's withered arm. On January 27th, 1859, in Berlin, Prince Friedrich Victor Wilhelm Albert Hohenzollern, Queen Victoria's first grandchild, note you, was born with his left arm around his neck. It took 3 days for anyone to notice that it had been damaged, but it was a problem which the future Emperor of Germany and King of Prussia would spend the rest of his life trying to conceal. Prince Wilhelm was left with Arab's palsy after a protracted breech birth, during which the two attending doctors were hamstrung by royal etiquette, forcing them to work beneath the mother's skirts. And the message summoning Berlin's foremost obstetrician got lost. And I believe, well, here, what is a breech birth? I have a mind of what the breech birth is, but why don't we just ask Dr. Google? Dr. Google and all the AI he rides in with. Okay, so the breech birth is when the feet come out first. The feet or the behind come out first. So there you go for the Kaiser. And because of that, we have a mention of the forceps, right? Permanent withering of the arm was probably caused by the damage done to Kaiser Wilhelm's nerves, though he was not Kaiser as a baby, and neck, damage done by the forceps, which dragged him out. Born blue, he was initially presumed dead and only brought round by vigorous rubbing, which probably only made the nerve damage worse. So perhaps the doctors underneath the skirts, which are dark, and whatever other handicaps were put upon them, try to rotate the baby. I think that's one of the responses to a breech birth. I have no idea why a breech birth should be a problem. You can take it up with your doctors. But anyway, I know it is a headache, and indeed caused another headache for young Wilhelm. It has been often, here's your psychohistory, speculated that oxygen deprivation at birth also left him with minor brain damage, a theory which certainly would explain the unstable personality for which he would become infamous. In early infancy, it became clear that the young prince's left arm was not growing properly. His left hand was a claw, and the arm a shrunken, dead weight. Physical prowess was prized amongst the Prussians, royals. So from the age of 6 months, the prince began to undergo arcane but undeniably imaginative treatments. You don't want that when it comes to 19th century medicine, imaginative treatments, intended to fix his damaged arm. Some treatments were inoffensively useless. The arm was sprayed with seawater, massaged, wrapped in cold compresses, but others were more macabre. The practice of weekly animal baths, which essentially require the arm to be shoved inside the carcass of a freshly killed animal so that the heat might galvanize, that's a very 19th century word, the shriveled tissue. The method of binding the young prince's good arm to his body so that his left arm would have to work, in the best pick yourselves up by your bootstraps 19th century mindset and German mindset, did little except compromise his balance, whilst drastic electric shock therapy was administered when he was barely a year old, courtesy of the works of Edison, if not Edison himself. At the age of 4, Wilhelm was placed in a body stretching machine akin to a medieval rack to correct the various muscular problems that had developed in his neck and shoulders. And here we see them as men. Wilhelm, as Wells notes, and as we're going to note now, was very good, and the press were well behaved to hiding his arm. So you can see Wilhelm's withered arm. Wilhelm's on the left of myself, facing the screen. You ought to be able to see my cursor. This is Wilhelm, a little bit shorter, I believe, than the that looks like the English king. But if you look at the German Kaiser, the English king, and the Russian Tsar, who are all, of course, all grandchildren of Vicky, Queen Vicky of England, they were all grandchildren. You can see they obviously have a family resemblance. You don't see the Tsar here, but you can see Wilhelm's withered arm, and he, to the point here, he and the press corps, so-called, did a very good job hiding his handicap. Oh, excuse me. Wow. Okay, so they really all did look alike. So Kaiser and Prince Henry. So this isn't, I thought this was the King of England. This is actually Prince Henry of Prussia. But they all look the same. If the 4 of them were together, they all look the same. And it's not just the mustaches being similar. Their facial features, because they're all related to Queen Victoria and they're all basically inbred. As an adult, the Kaiser was semi-successful in hiding his withered arm, as we noted in formal pictures. He typically posed with his left hand resting on his sword, with the right on top, and with gloves to provide distraction. His clothes were tailored with higher pockets to disguise the length of his left arm, and he grew adept at shooting and riding with his right arm. Historic videos show passable movement in his left arm, and a 1915 edition of the Toronto World even claimed that a series of strings and cords acting like muscles connected with good muscles to the shoulder most adroitly enabled him to impart it with movements that are almost lifelike. Kind of a tip of the hat, especially in 1915, to the burgeoning prosthesis industry. So that's not actually that far-fetched that such a contraption would exist. And you'll notice that's one of the more reliable, actually, and innovative and enduring products of the First World War was a certain prosthesis which would allow prosthetic movement of an arm, of a fake arm, based off of the other musculature on the back and the shoulders. So that's hardly inconceivable how the Toronto world would come up with this. The Kaiser's physical deficiency has often been identified as the key to his lust for military and imperial power. And it is interesting to speculate on the course of European history, what it might have been had it taken, what course it might have taken had he not had such a traumatic entry into the world. There you go. There's your nibble of psychohistory with the Kaiser there, with, as we found out, Prince Henry of Prussia, but they all look the spitting image, all the monarchs, one of another at this point. So, as we knock off here on this class 298 of the project, we have our run-up, a look at the differences. Try that again. No. Wowzers. They have about 10. No. Wow. They have about 10 times more buttons you have to click here. And it does make it more malleable, but it does cut against StreamYard's claim to fame, which was ease of use. Anyway, in this chapter 38, section 2, just to recap, we have a look at educational models, and we know that after the Napoleonic Wars, Germany led the world, even after the First World War, you can argue. Then we had an economical meditation from H.G. Wells, the fact that German capitalism, like German education, was far greater than in the rest of the world. Unlike German education, arguably, German capitalism was also leading in its humanity. It wasn't just a robot factory. And introducing the meditation of the world wars, or basically the English-speaking society's attempt and successful attempt to claw down the excellence of Germany. We'll revisit this again and again in our remaining month and a half of this cycle of the project. We begin again on the 2nd of September. We hope you can join us from the start. And then we looked at psychohistory and Kaiser Wilhelm II's withered arm. And the final sentence of the article we looked at is really the nutshell takeaway, which is, how did this man's handicap, so-called, how did that affect his rather ambitious plans militarily and politically? And indeed, how does the behavior of the German state, how does that reflect previous events, indeed going back even to the Roman Empire, and the fact that Germany always resisted entry into that political and commercial confederacy? How does that affect later thought patterns? If you were at this generation right before the First World War, these historical points would be very prescient indeed. Well, so is lunchtime here, so I'm going to knock off. And I thank you for joining us in this class 298 of the project. Please check out that project website down below. In particular, our special focus, which is, let's see here. I'll remind myself as soon as you. Yes, we need a space. We need a living space to build out culture. We're simply not going to do things by listening to podcasts forever, or even classes and whatnot. We need a space here. So do check out that presentation in text and in video. We're going to need a bigger boat. And there's all sorts of other things to take care of on the site, but it is lunchtime. And so I'll cut you loose and I'll cut myself loose. And I'll see you soon enough as we move towards that great catastrophe of the Great War. Take care now.